The slave market on Station Keth Prime smelled like rust and fear, and the cold metal floors had seen thousands of broken souls pass through over the centuries. Danny Cole stood on the auction platform with his wrists locked in energy cuffs that buzzed against his skin, and he kept his eyes forward while aliens of every shape and size stared at him like he was garbage. He was 32 years old, a former cargo pilot from Earth who had been running supplies near the frontier when Zerathi raiders hit his ship and killed his crew. And 3 months in their holding cells had turned him into a shadow of the man he used to be. His brown hair hung dirty and limp over his forehead. His cheeks had gone hollow from hunger, and the torn gray jumpsuit they gave him hung loose on his thin frame. The auctioneer was a Keth, a four-armed creature covered in rust-colored scales, who stood 8 feet tall and spoke in a bored voice that the translator chip in Danny's ear converted to flat English. Human. Male, the Keth announced to the crowd, waving one of his 4 hands dismissively toward Danny. Minimal physical strength, no natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no protective exoskeleton, no venom glands, no regeneration abilities. The auctioneer paused and looked at a datapad in his lower left hand. This species requires constant hydration, cannot regulate body temperature effectively, has poor vision in low light, and possesses one of the slowest natural healing rates in the known galaxy. Laughter rippled through the crowd of buyers, and Danny felt their contempt wash over him like dirty water. A massive Varax warrior pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his tusked face twisted in amusement and his yellow eyes gleaming with mockery. Varax stood nearly 9 feet tall with arms as thick as tree trunks and skin that looked like gray stone. 50 credits for a creature that dies from temperature changes. The Varax bellowed, and more laughter followed his words. A creature that cannot see in darkness and breaks its bones from simple falls? You insult us by putting such weakness on display. Danny kept his face empty and his breathing steady, because he had learned quickly that showing emotion only invited more cruelty from these aliens who saw humans as the lowest form of intelligent life. But even as he stood there looking defeated, his eyes were moving and his mind was working. He counted the guards in the room and noted their positions near the exits, measured the distances between the platform and the TTU doors. He studied the weapons the guards carried and the way they held themselves. These were old habits from his military days, before he became a civilian pilot, and they had kept him alive through 3 months of captivity when others had given up and died. Auction continued with no real interest from the buyers, and Danny watched as species after species was sold for thousands of credits while he stood ignored on the platform. A Talith female, tall and graceful with arms like a praying mantis, sold for 12,000 credits because her species made excellent navigators. A Ven male, short and stocky with 4 eyes and 6 fingers on each hand, sold for 8,000 because his people were natural engineers. A Draketh warrior, covered in black scales with claws that could tear through metal, sold for 15,000 because his kind were prized as bodyguards. And then there was Danny, the human, worth less than the food it would take to keep him alive. Final call for the human, the auctioneer said without enthusiasm. Starting bid reduced to 30 credits. A Keth in the back of the room raised one of his 4 hands lazily. 30 credits for the Mayan Consortium. The auctioneer confirmed. The human goes to the acid pits of Neth 4. Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach because he had heard stories about Neth 4, and none of them were good. The planet's atmosphere was toxic to most species, and the mines there extracted rare minerals from pools of corrosive acid that ate through protective suits within weeks. Slaves sent to Neth 4 had a life expectancy measured in days, not months. Guards came forward and grabbed Danny's arms, pulling him off the platform and shoving him toward the transport bay where other Unfortunate souls waited for their journey to death as they dragged him through the station's corridors. Danny passed a group of Zerathi officers in their midnight blue armor. The same species that had captured him and killed his friends, one of them. A commander with silver rank markings on his chest and vertical pupils that contracted as he examined Danny. Stopped and watched him pass. Another human for the mines? The commander said to his companions, his voice carrying a tone of casual disgust. Such fragile things these creatures are. And I do not understand why the universe bothered creating them. One of the other officers laughed and made a gesture that Danny did not recognize, but understood was insulting. They say humans were once proud of themselves, another officer added. They thought they were special because they built cities and flew ships, but look at them now, crawling in the dirt where they belong. Danny said nothing as the guards pushed him forward, but he heard every word and he remembered every face. The transport ship was cramped and dark, filled with 30 slaves from a dozen different species, who had all been purchased for the Neth-4 mines. Danny found a corner and sat down on the cold floor, pulling his knees to his chest and closing his eyes around him. Other slaves wept or prayed to gods Danny had never heard of, and some simply sat in silence waiting for death to come. A Talith female settled beside him, her compound eyes catching the dim light and her mandibles clicking softly. You are the human they sold for 30 credits, she said, her voice clicking and buzzing through the translator. Yes, Danny replied without opening his eyes. I am called Kiraset, and I was a navigator before raiders destroyed my ship and my crew. Danny opened his eyes and looked at her, seeing the same hollow expression he knew was on his own face. Danny Cole, he said. Cargo pilot. Kiraset made a sound that might have been a laugh. We are both pilots who lost our ships and our freedom. And now we are both going to die in the acid pits of a dead world. Danny looked at her for a long moment. And then he did something that surprised them both. He smiled. Maybe, he said quietly, so only she could hear. Or maybe we are both going somewhere that nobody expects us to come back from, which means nobody will be watching too closely. Kiraset's compound eyes shifted as she studied him, and her mandibles stopped their nervous clicking. You are planning something, she said. Danny's smile faded, and his eyes went hard in a way that made the alien beside him suddenly very aware that humans might be weak in body. But there was something else behind those soft eyes, something that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed their entire species, something that refused to die no matter how many times the universe tried to kill. And I am always planning something, Danny said. And then he closed his eyes again and let the ship carry him toward what everyone believed would be his grave. But Danny Cole had been written off before, and he was still breathing. The Keth thought they had bought a worthless human for their death mines. They had no idea what they had actually purchased. The planet Neth-4 was a nightmare made real, with skies the color of bile and air that burned the lungs of anyone foolish enough to breathe it. Without protection, Danny Cole had been there for 6 weeks, and in that time he had watched 14 of the 20 slaves who arrived with him die in ways that would haunt his dreams forever. Some died when their protective suits developed tiny cracks that let the acid atmosphere seep through and eat their flesh. Some died when the brutal labor of the mines broke their bodies beyond repair. Some died when the Keth overseers decided they were not working fast enough and made examples of them. But Danny survived, because Danny had learned very early that survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being useful. The Keth mining operation used old equipment that had been salvaged from human colonies decades ago, and the Keth engineers had no idea how to maintain it properly. Danny did. He had spent years working on freight stations during his early career, repairing the same types of drills and extractors and transport systems that the Keth were using here when A drilling rig in Sector 7 broke down and the Keth overseer threatened to throw Danny into the acid pools if he could not fix it. Danny walked calmly to the machine and studied it for 10 minutes. The Keth had connected the power coupling incorrectly, creating a feedback loop that was slowly destroying the main processor. Danny fixed it in 20 minutes using tools he found lying in the maintenance shed, and the overseer stared at him with something that might have been surprise word spread through the facility that the worthless human knew how to fix things. And soon Danny was being pulled from mining duty. Regularly, he optimized extraction rates that had been declining for months. He repaired equipment that the Keth engineers had declared beyond saving. He solved problems that had baffled the facility's technical staff for years. His value increased, and his rations improved, and his living conditions upgraded from a shared cell with 6 other slaves to a private quarters with a real bed and running water. The Keth overseer, a scarred veteran named Threk, who had run the mines for 15 years, began to treat Danny with something approaching respect. "You are strange for a human," Threk said one day while Danny was rewiring a malfunctioning transport lift. "Your kind usually dies within the first week, but you keep finding ways to be useful." Danny did not look up from his work. "Humans are good at adapting," he said, keeping his voice neutral and his hands steady. "We have had a lot of practice." Threk made a rumbling sound in his throat that might have been laughter. "Perhaps. But do not think your usefulness will save you forever, because this world kills everyone eventually." Danny nodded and continued his work. But inside his mind, he was doing something very different from simple repairs. He was learning the facility's layout, memorizing every corridor and every doorway and every ventilation shaft. He was studying the guard rotations, noting when the overseers changed shifts and where they gathered during their breaks. He was identifying weaknesses in the security systems, including the alarm triggers and the communication relays and the backup power generators, and he was building relationships with other slaves who had skills that might prove useful. The Talith navigator Kiraset had survived the first 6 weeks alongside Danny, and she still retained knowledge of local star charts that could guide a ship through the dangerous space around the Keth sector of N. Engineer named Pak 3 understood the facility's power grid better than the Keth who had built it, and he had quietly shared that knowledge with Danny during their work shifts. A Dracoth chemist called Sorn had figured out how to synthesize useful compounds from the mining byproducts, including a sedative that could knock out a Keth guard in seconds. A Morthani strongman named Prath commanded respect among the labor crews, and his word could move 100 slaves to action. Danny met with each of them in secret, in corners of the facility where the surveillance systems had blind spots that he had carefully mapped over weeks of observation. "You are building something," Kiraset said one night as they huddled in a maintenance tunnel far from watching eyes. "A network of people with skills. And I do not think you are doing this just to make your life easier." Danny looked at the 4 aliens who had gathered at his request, seeing hope in their eyes for the first time since he had arrived on this death world. "The Keth have ruled this sector for 300 years," he said quietly. "They have crushed every rebellion before it could begin, and they have convinced everyone that resistance is impossible, because it is impossible," Pak 3 said, his 4 eyes blinking nervously. "They have weapons and ships and soldiers, and we have nothing." Danny shook his head. "We have something they do not expect," he said. "We have patience, and we have coordination, and we have knowledge that they gave us themselves by forcing us to maintain their equipment." He looked at each of them in turn. "Humans have fought wars against stronger enemies for thousands of years, and we have won many of those wars not through strength, but through tactics." "What are tactics?" Krath asked, his massive form shifting in the cramped tunnel. Danny smiled, and in that smile was something hard and sharp that made the aliens around him suddenly very attentive. Tactics are how the weak defeat the strong, Danny said. And I am going to teach you everything I know. Over the following months, Danny held secret meetings in maintenance tunnels and storage rooms and abandoned mining shafts. He taught his growing network of rebels about concepts that had been refined through thousands of years of human warfare. He explained sabotage, the art of breaking things in ways that looked accidental. He described misdirection, the practice of making your enemy look one way while you attacked from another. He outlined psychological operations, the method of breaking an enemy's will before you ever fired a weapon. He detailed guerrilla tactics, the strategy of using small strikes to wear down a larger force over time. The Keth had ruled through overwhelming power for so long that they had forgotten how to fight an enemy they could not see. They were about to remember. Small things began to go wrong around the facility. Equipment failed in ways that seemed random, but were actually carefully planned. Supply shipments were delayed by damaged manifests that nobody could trace. Guard schedules were disrupted by false alarms that sent overseers running to parts of the facility where nothing was actually happening. Each incident was isolated and deniable, and the Keth blamed bad luck and aging infrastructure. They never suspected the worthless human they had bought for 30 credits. Danny watched and waited and planned, and every night he lay in his quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about the Zirathi commander who had called him a fragile thing. He thought about his dead crew and his destroyed ship and the 3 months he had spent in chains. He thought about every alien who had laughed at him on that auction platform, and he smiled in the darkness. Because they had marked him as weak, they had no idea how wrong they were. The rebellion began not with explosions or gunfire, but with a whisper that passed from slave to slave in the darkness of the mines. Danny Cole had spent 4 months building his network, recruiting carefully and training secretly, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on a night when the yellow moon of Neth 4 hung low over the acid pools, and the facility hummed with the sound of machinery that never stopped at exactly midnight. The power grid failed. Every light in the mining complex went dark at once, and for 3 heartbeats there was nothing but silence and blackness. Then the screaming started. Danny moved through the maintenance tunnels he had memorized over months of careful observation, his feet finding their way in the darkness while chaos erupted above him. Keth guards were stumbling blind through corridors they had walked 1,000 times, because they had never bothered to learn the layout without their electronic maps to guide them. But Danny knew every turn and every junction by heart. 30 rebels followed him through the tunnels, armed with weapons they had assembled from mining equipment over weeks of secret work. Hiraset was at his right side, her compound eyes able to see in the darkness better than any Kethgrath. The Morthani strongman was at his left, carrying a length of metal pipe that could crush a skull with a single swing. They emerged behind enemy lines, in a section of the facility where the Keth commanders had set up a defensive position, expecting the slaves to attack from the front. The guards never saw them coming. Danny killed his first Keth with a mining drill modified into a makeshift spear, driving the point through the gap in the guard's armor. Where the neck met the shoulder, the alien made a wet gurgling sound and collapsed, and Danny was already moving to the next target before the body hit the ground around him. His rebels struck with speed and precision, using the tactics Danny had taught them over months of secret meetings. They did not fight fair, because fair fights were for people who could afford to lose. They attacked from shadows and vanished before the Keth could respond. They targeted officers first to create confusion in the enemy ranks. They cut communication lines so guards could not call for backup. They used a sedative Sorn had synthesized to drop enemies silently when stealth was needed the Keth had overwhelming firepower and superior numbers. But none of that mattered when they could not see their enemy or coordinate their response. Overseer Threk rallied a group of guards in the main processing center. His scarred face twisted with rage as he bellowed orders into a communicator that only returned static. "Find the human," Threk roared. "He is behind this, I know it." Danny stepped out of the shadows behind him, and Threk spun around with his weapon raised. But Danny was faster. He had learned long ago. That speed came not from physical ability, but from knowing exactly what you were going to do before you did. The mining pick in his hand caught Threk in the throat before the Overseer could fire. And the Keth, who had run these mines for 15 years, fell to his knees with surprise in his dying eyes. "You were right about one thing," Danny said as Threk collapsed. "This world kills everyone eventually." The fighting continued for 6 hours as bisters. Danny's rebels swept through the facility section by section. Some Keth surrendered when they realized they were losing, and Danny ordered them locked in the holding cells that had once held slaves. Others fought to the death, and Danny gave them the deaths they sought by the time the yellow sun rose over the acid pools. The slaves controlled the mining complex. 400 beings gathered in the main hangar, looking at Danny with expressions that ranged from disbelief to hope to fear. They were Talith and Ven and Draketh and Morthani, and a dozen other species. All of them freed from chains by a human they had been told was worthless. Danny stood on a cargo crate so everyone could see him, his clothes stained with blood and ash and the grime of the tunnels. "The Keth will send a fleet to retake this facility," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "They will come with warships and soldiers and enough firepower to turn this entire complex into molten slag." Fear rippled through the crowd, and some of the freed slaves began to weep. "But we are not going to be here when they arrive," Danny continued. And the fear turned to confusion. He gestured toward the communication console behind him. "I have sent messages on every frequency I can reach, broadcasting our coordinates and the details of what we have done here tonight. And I have invited any ship willing to help us escape to come to Neth 4. Kiraset stepped forward, her mandibles clicking with concern. What ships would answer such a call? "The Keth control this entire sector," Danny smiled. And in that smile was something that the aliens in the crowd did not quite understand. It was hope, but it was also certainty. "The Keth have made many enemies over 300 years of cruelty," he said. "And enemies tend to appear when they smell blood in the water." He looked down at the 400 faces watching him, at the species he had lived alongside and fought beside and bled with. "The Keth marked us all as worthless," Danny said. "They threw us away in these mines and expected us to die quietly. But we are still here." He raised his voice so it echoed off the hangar walls. "We are still here, and we are going home." A cheer rose from the crowd, raw and desperate and full of emotions that had been suppressed for years under the weight of chains. Danny let them have their moment, because they had earned it. But even as they celebrated, his mind was already working on the next problem ships might answer his call. But the Keth fleet would arrive eventually, and 400 freed slaves were no match for military warships. He needed to buy time, and he needed to turn the space around Neth 4 into a trap. Danny climbed down from the cargo crate and found Pak 3 waiting for him with a datapad. "I have completed the inventory you requested," the Ven engineer said, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. "We have access to significant quantities of mining explosives in the storage bunkers." Danny took the datapad and studied the numbers. How much damage could these explosives do to a Keth destroyer? Pak 3's eyes blinked even faster. "Significant damage if placed correctly, but we have no way to deliver them against military vessels." Danny looked up at the ceiling of the hangar, past the metal and the rock, toward the stars he could not see. "We do not need to deliver them," he said quietly. We just need to put them somewhere the Keth will not expect. He handed the datapad back to POC 3. Get me everything you have on the orbital debris field around this planet. And find Sorn the chemist and tell him, I need compounds that can mask energy signatures from sensors. POC 3 stared at him for a moment. Then understanding dawned in his 4 eyes. You are going to build a trap. The Ven said. Danny nodded. The Keth think they're coming to crush helpless slaves, he said. They are going to learn that helpless is not the same as harmless. He walked away to begin the next phase of his plan. And POC 3 watched him go with something new in his expression. It was respect, and it was fear. And it was wonder because the Ven had studied humans in his engineering courses. And he had been taught that they were one of the weakest intelligent species in the galaxy. Nobody had ever told him that weak and dangerous were not opposites. The Keth response fleet arrived 47 hours after Danny Cole sent his message to the stars. And Commander Zethik stood on the bridge of his flagship watching Net 4 grow larger in the viewscreen. Zethik was the same silver-ranked officer who had dismissed Danny in the slave market months ago, calling humans fragile things that the universe should not have bothered creating. He had been given command of 12 warships to crush the rebellion and restore order to the mining facility. Burn them all. Zethik ordered from his command throne. His vertical pupils narrow with anticipation. Leave nothing standing. And let this be a lesson to every slave in the sector who thinks they can defy the Keth Empire. The fleet moved into attack formation. Weapons charging and shields humming with power. The tactical officer studied his screens and saw nothing but the standard debris field that surrounded the planet. Chunks of rock and metal left over from ancient asteroid impacts. Commander, we are detecting no resistance, the tactical officer reported. The facility appears to be defenseless. Zethik made a dismissive gesture with one of his 4 hands. Of course they are defenseless. Because they are slaves and vermin who got lucky against a handful of guards. He leaned forward in his throne, moved the fleet into bombardment range, and prepared to fire on my command. The first Keth destroyer exploded without warning. One moment the ship was cruising toward the planet in perfect formation, and the next moment it vanished in a flash of white light, so bright that view screens across the fleet flickered and Dimajethik lurched forward, his claws digging into the arms of his throne. What is happening? Report immediately. The tactical officer's voice trembled as he studied the data streaming across his screens. Commander, the debris field is not what it appears, and our sensors are detecting energy signatures in the wreckage that were not there seconds ago. Another explosion ripped through space as a second destroyer struck something invisible in the darkness. The blast triggered a chain reaction in the ship's reactor core, sending shrapnel tearing through a third vessel that had been flying too close. 3 ships destroyed in less than 30 seconds. And the Keth fleet had not even reached firing range. Danny Cole had spent 47 hours turning the orbital space around Net 4 into a killing field. The mining explosives from the facility's storage bunkers had been loaded onto transport pods and launched into the debris field, where they drifted silently among the asteroids. Sorn's chemical compounds masked their energy signatures from standard sensors, making them invisible until a ship flew close enough to trigger their proximity fuses. The debris field was now a minefield, and the Keth fleet had flown straight into it without suspecting a thing. All ships scatter. Zethik bellowed. Find safe approach vectors and regroup at a distance. The fleet broke formation as commanders tried to navigate through the deadly debris. But scattering was exactly what Danny wanted, divided and confused. The mighty Keth warships were suddenly vulnerable. 3 vessels answered Danny's earlier transmission and dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the system. The first was a Talith trading ship crewed by freed slaves who had escaped Keth territory years ago and had been waiting for a chance to strike. Back the second was a human mercenary vessel called the Desperado, a battered gunship that had been running illegal cargo in the frontier and had heard Danny's message through channels that the Keth could not. Monitor the third was an ancient Ven cruiser that had been hiding in the outer reaches of the system for decades, its crew surviving on hope and hatred while they waited for someone brave enough to challenge the Empire. The battle that followed was not fair, and Danny had never intended it to be fair. The Keth still had superior numbers and firepower, but Danny had studied their tactics through months of observation and had identified their weaknesses. He knew that Keth warships relied heavily on automated targeting systems, so he had programmed the mining facility's communication array to flood the area with false sensor signatures that confused their weapons locks. He knew that Keth commanders followed rigid protocols that required them to await orders from their superiors before adapting to unexpected situations. So he focused fire on Zethic's flagship to create confusion in the chain of command. He knew that the Keth viewed retreat as shameful and would fight to the death rather than withdraw. So he left an obvious escape route open and watched as their discipline crumbled when individual captains realized they could flee rather than die. The Desperado swept through the scattered Keth formation with weapons blazing, its human crew fighting with a ferocity that surprised even their allies. The Talith trader used its superior maneuverability to draw fire away from the slower Ven cruiser, which unleashed devastating salvos from weapons that had been maintained and upgraded for 30 years. In anticipation of this moment, Danny coordinated the battle from the mining facility's control room, watching sensor data scroll across screens that had been designed to monitor drilling operations, but now displayed the movement of warships. The destroyer on the left flank is trying to break through to bombardment range, Kiraset reported from her position at the navigation console. If they reach firing distance, they can destroy the facility before our ships can intercept. Danny studied the screen for 3 seconds, then made his decision. Tell the Ven cruiser to ignore the destroyer and focus fire on the flagship. Instead, Kiraset's mandibles clicked in surprise. But the destroyer will... Trust me, Danny said. The Ven cruiser turned its weapons on Zethic's flagship, and the Keth commander suddenly found himself under concentrated attack from multiple directions. His shields buckled under the assault, and warning alarms screamed throughout his bridge as systems began to fail. Zethic faced a choice: maintain his attack on the facility, or break off to defend himself. He chose survival, ordering his flagship to retreat and regroup. The moment his ship turned away, the other Keth captains saw their leader fleeing, and their courage broke. 4 more vessels followed Zethic into faster-than-light escape, abandoning the battle and leaving their remaining companions to face the rebel fleet alone. The destroyer that had been threatening the facility found itself suddenly alone against 3 enemy ships. Its captain surrendered within minutes. When the battle ended 3 hours after it began, 7 Keth warships had been destroyed, and 1 had been captured intact. The remaining 4 had fled with Commander Zethic, carrying news of the defeat back to Keth command. Danny stood in the control room surrounded by his allies, watching the last Keth vessel disappear into the distance. We won, Pak 3 said, his 4 eyes wide with disbelief. We actually won against a Keth war fleet. Danny did not smile, because he knew this was only the beginning. We survived, he corrected. The Keth will send more ships, and next time they will not underestimate us. He turned to face the beings who had gathered around him, the freed slaves and the rebel crews and the fighters who had risked everything on his plan. We need to leave this system before reinforcements arrive, and we need to spread the word about what happened here. Kiraset stepped forward. What word? That a group of slaves defeated a Keth fleet? Danny shook his head. No. The word that it is possible to fight back and win. He looked out the window at the debris field that had become a graveyard for Keth warships. The Keth have ruled through fear for 300 years, and today we proved that they can be beaten. He turned back to his allies. Let every slave in the sector hear what we did here, and let them know that the Keth are not invincible. Commander Zethik was brought before Danny an hour later. Captured when his escape pod was intercepted by the Desperado, the Keth commander knelt on the deck of the mining facility, where his kind had worked thousands of slaves to death. And he looked up at the human who had destroyed his fleet. "You," Zethik whispered, recognition dawning in his vertical pupils. The human from the auction block. The worthless one. Danny looked down at him without hatred, but also without mercy. "You asked once why the universe bothered creating humans," he said. "Do you want to know the answer?" Zethik said nothing, but Danny told him anyway. "We are persistence predators," Danny said. "We do not need to be faster or stronger or better armored than our enemies, because we just need to keep going until they cannot anymore." He crouched down so he was eye level with the Keth commander. "You marked me as weak because I lack claws and scales and venom. But weakness is not the same as helplessness." Danny stood and walked away, leaving Zethik kneeling on the deck. "Put him in a cell," he said to the guards. "He will stand trial for his crimes when we reach safe space behind him." The Keth commander stared at the floor and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He had brought 12 warships to crush a slave rebellion. He had lost 7 and been captured by a creature he had dismissed as worthless, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The news of Neth 4 spread across the sector like fire through dry grass, carried by traders and smugglers and escaped slaves who whispered the story to anyone who would listen. A human had been sold for 30 credits and sent to die in the acid mines. That same human had organized a rebellion, freed 400 slaves, and defeated a Keth war fleet in open battle. The story grew with each telling, becoming legend and myth and hope for beings who had lived under Keth oppression for generations. Slave populations on a dozen worlds began to stir, and resistance cells that had been hiding for years suddenly found new recruits willing to fight the Keth Empire, which had seemed unshakable for 3 centuries, was suddenly facing challenges on multiple fronts. Danny Cole watched all of this from the bridge of the Desperado as the small fleet of rebel ships made its way toward Earth, and he felt the weight of what he had started pressing down on his shoulders. He had not wanted to become a symbol or a leader or a legend, had just wanted to survive and go home. The journey took 3 months, with stops along the way to gather supplies and pick up refugees from Keth-controlled spaceward. Of Danny's identity spread through the underground networks, and beings from species he had never encountered came to meet the human who had humbled an empire. Some wanted to join his cause and fight alongside him. Others just wanted to see if the stories were true. Danny met them all with the same quiet patience he had shown in the minds of Neth 4, listening to their stories and answering their questions and trying to convince them that he was nothing special. Nobody believed him. Lisa Vance, the captain of the Desperado, was a grizzled woman in her 50s who had been running cargo in the frontier for 30 years and had seen things that would break most people even. She looked at Danny differently after watching him coordinate the battle at Neth 4. "You know they are going to make you into something you do not want to be," Lisa said one night as they sat in the ship's small galley. "A hero or a saint or a symbol for the resistance." Danny stared at the cup of coffee in his hands, watching the steam rise toward the ceiling. "I know," he said. "And you are going to let them?" Danny was silent for a long moment. "My grandfather fought in a war on Earth a long time ago," he finally said. "He told me once that nobody asks to be a hero, and heroes are just ordinary people who end up in situations where they have to choose between doing what is easy and doing what is right." He looked up at Lisa. I did not choose to be captured by raiders or sold into slavery or sent to the mines. But once I was there, I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be. Lisa nodded slowly. And you chose to fight. I chose to survive, Danny corrected. And sometimes surviving means fighting. Earth's orbital defense grid challenged them as they entered the Sol system. And Danny felt his heart catch in his throat as he looked through the view screen at the blue and white marble that he had dreamed about every night for the past year. Home, he took the communications console himself, his hands trembling slightly as he activated the channel. Unidentified vessels, this is Earth Defense Command. State your purpose and origin immediately. Danny's voice was rough from disuse, but the words came clearly. This is Danny Cole. Citizen identification number 7749 Alpha 3. And I was captured by Zerathi raiders 11 months ago in the frontier zone. And I am requesting permission to come home. Silence on the channel, then a different voice. Younger and uncertain. Sir, we have Danny Cole listed as deceased. And his ship was found destroyed with no survivors. Danny closed his eyes and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. I survived, he said simply. More silence. Then the sound of hasty conversations in the background. Finally, the defense grid stood down, and an escort of fighter craft appeared to guide the rebel fleet toward Luna Station. Danny stood at the viewport as Earth grew larger, its oceans and clouds and continents exactly as he remembered them behind him. The refugees who had followed him across the sector, gathered to see a human world for the first time. Kiraset stood at his shoulder, her compound eyes reflecting the planet's light. Your world is beautiful, she said. It is, Danny agreed. What will you do now? You could lead the resistance and unite the free species against the Keth, and become the symbol everyone already believes you are. Danny was quiet for a long moment. I am just a cargo pilot who got captured, he said. I did what I had to do to survive. And anyone would have done the same. Kiraset made the clicking sound that was her species' expression of disbelief. No, not anyone, and you know this as well as I do. She placed one of her long arms on his shoulder. You were marked as weak, Danny Cole, and they threw you away like garbage. But you rose and you endured and you conquered. The shuttle docked with Luna Station, and Danny walked down the ramp into a receiving bay filled with more people than he had seen in almost a year. Reporters shouted questions, while cameras floated around capturing every angle. Officials in formal uniforms demanded immediate debriefings. Families of other captured humans pushed through the crowd, begging for information about their missing loved ones. Danny answered what he could, providing intelligence about Keth operations and coordinates of slave facilities and names of sympathetic aliens who might help future rescue missions. Then he politely excused himself and walked alone to the observation deck where he could look down at Earth in silence. He stood there for hours, watching the planet rotate below him and feeling the weight of everything he had been through settling into his bones. A young officer found him eventually, a lieutenant named Amy Torres, who had been assigned as his official liaison. Mr. Cole, the Admiral would like to speak with you about the resistance network you established. And there is discussion about forming an official alliance with the Talith and Ven survivors. Danny did not turn around. Tell the Admiral I will help however I can. But I am not a leader, and I am not a soldier. And I am just a man who refused to die when everyone expected him to. Lieutenant Torres hesitated. Sir, with respect, that is exactly what a leader is. Danny finally turned to face her, looking at this young woman in her crisp uniform, who had never known chains or acid mines or despair of being marked as worthless. Then I suppose I will have to learn, he said quietly. He walked past her toward the Admiral's office, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The path ahead would be difficult. because the Keth would not forgive what had happened at Nethfor, and the war Danny had started would claim many lives before it ended. But for the first time since he had been captured 11 months ago, Danny Cole felt something like hope, not hope for himself, because he had long since accepted that his life might be the price of freedom for others, hope for the future. For the slaves still in chains who would hear his story and find the courage to fight. For the alliance that was forming between species who had been oppressed for too long. For the day when the Keth Empire would finally fall, he had been marked as weak by beings who measured strength in claws and scales, and venom. They had been wrong, because strength was not about what you were born with, it was about what you refused to give up. Danny Cole had never given up anything in his life. Behind him, through the observation deck's massive windows, Earth continued its ancient rotation beneath the stars, and somewhere across the galaxy, other beings who had been marked as worthless were hearing his story and beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rise too. The Keth had created a monster when they threw Danny into those mines. They just had not realized it until it was far too late.